All right. Welcome, folks.
Hey, Abby. Hey, everybody. So we're good to go. We are live streamed and all set.
Perfect. Good work, Raleigh. Second time's a charm. All right, we have task force members joining, so I'm going to give folks just a minute to join on. Welcome, Tazra. Am I pronouncing your name right?
Yes. Good evening.
Hey, Tazra, so good to see you
tonight.
Good to see you too, Raleigh.
Welcome, welcome, folks. All right, I think we now have a majority of the task force. I know other folks are going to be signing on, and we've got about 10 attendees right now on Zoom, and whoever else is watching on YouTube. I'm dropping into the chat again tonight's deck, so that if it's easier for you to follow along that way, you can go to that link. All right. Let me make sure we're not hearing from anyone who's having trouble getting in. All right. Well, let's go ahead and jump in. I know that we've got a number of other people who are going to be joining from the task force, but I want to respect everybody's time and get to work. So welcome all to meeting number 8 of this task force, which originally would have been our final meeting, but we love each other so much that we're going to push forward a little bit beyond here. But it is a very consequential meeting because we are going to be looking at our first round report that is due in less than 48 hours. And hopefully we'll approve that as a group, but want to make sure we give people a chance to voice anything that they've got on their mind with respect to that. Let me share my screen and we can talk through tonight's agenda. So again, welcome all, and Tazra is going to be pinch hitting for Rakaya, who was on an airplane. So thank you for doing that. So as I said, we're going to hopefully approve our initial report this evening. Before we do that, there are a couple things that that I want to highlight, and want to give people a chance to voice anything that they want to share publicly before we move forward to vote on the recommendations. And then I hope we'll be able to spend a good chunk of tonight's meeting looking beyond this first report to report number 2, and initially to outline what are the big outstanding issues that we have not yet addressed in this report that we think we will need to address in the next one. And then actually start digging into one of those that we have begun thinking about a little bit, but had not had not landed the plane on, around experience and how we think about experience in the salary scale. So I'm hoping we'll get to spend some time on that this evening to begin that work. So before we get there, though, I'm going to stop sharing so we can see each other, and want to turn to the report that you all have had a chance to look at. First, I want to thank all of you for spending what clearly was significant time on a bunch of your parts, really going through this report, looking at it with careful eyes, catching a whole bunch of stuff, clarifying things, suggesting that we strengthen how we talk about some of the particular issues in the report. Really appreciated everybody's engagement on this. And I have addressed people's feedback, have responded to folks individually, but you'll see, you saw in the report things that were updated. There was nothing that anybody raised about the contents of the report that they said would preclude them from moving forward with this version. But there were certainly things that people identified that they either want to make sure we start thinking further about in the next report, or things that they wanted to strengthen, clarify, that sort of thing. So I've gotten the question from several of you in the last couple of days about how we're thinking about these recommendations versus what comes in the next report. And so I wanted to just frame that for everybody, so that we're on the same page in terms of how you then think about the question of approving the report tonight. So essentially, there are things that we have not addressed in report 1 that will be new content in report 2, and some of those are things that were expressly part of our charge, and so noted in the first report that we have yet to discuss that. And then there will certainly be an opportunity to flesh out existing things in this report where we have some initial recommendation, but we want to build on it, strengthen it, add more, more clarity or detail. So that will certainly be an opportunity. So if there's something in here that you agree with, but you think we need to be clear, or we need to be more forceful, or we need to give more detail, there'll be an opportunity for that. What I think we should be assuming on the sort of flip side of that is that we will not be reversing any of the recommendations in this report. So the idea is, if it's in here, it's something that we think should move forward. Again, could be clearer, could be fleshed out, but that things we're not going to reopen everything in this report for the next report for lots of obvious reasons, but including that the council is expecting this report to be able to move forward with giving ECE some initial authority to get going on the short-term mechanism. And the reason that we specifically split the report into 2 was so that we could hit this January 15th deadline, such that ECE can begin working expeditiously to move towards the short-term mechanism. So that's sort of the conceptually how we're thinking about that. I wanted to note a couple of things that I think were particularly sort of pointed out in the report that people weighed in on. One was around just some stronger language throughout around ensuring that we're really prioritizing equity of access. And, equity is one of our guiding principles on this. And there were a number of places where you all pointed out areas where we needed to really think about things like language access, things like ensuring that unbanked individuals have access to funds in easy ways. How we make sure that that everyone who is eligible for these funds really has, the access to get them. So appreciate those pushes, and I think that's much clearer in here. Also places where there's going to be support needed for providers, and that thinking about TA from a sort of broad standpoint. What are the supports that are going to be needed to implement these things well? So that's another area where a bunch of people pointed out some issues. There was another issue that came up from a number of you all, that there is some strengthened language in the report, but I wanted to flag, and that is around this question of the potential impact of giving a lump sum payment to educators, and the risk that might cause some folks to exit their roles or the profession, given this significant dollars that we're talking about. And it's something that we talked about earlier. It's come up. As a number of you all have noted, the general goal of retention is obviously an important one in this work overall. We know that there's been a labor crisis in this arena, and we know that we need to attract and retain great educators to be working with our youngest children. So obviously the retention issue is one that's been a thread throughout all of this. As it relates to the issue of the supplemental payments, it's a concern that a number of folks have raised, and so I wanted to flag it and note that you will see in the report a few references to the importance of retention and some of the things that we think are important to think about with respect to that. One of which we've already discussed, which is the idea of separating out payments into multiple installments. And there obviously, and we've talked about how we weigh that against the importance of getting dollars out, and the priority that the council certainly has put on spending, the FY22 dollars. There are a couple of ways that folks have talked about how we might address that, and so I just want to name these because I think this is something that that I've heard from a number of you. One is that to urge ECE, which Sarah has already been clear that she's on board with this concept, but to work as quickly as possible to set up the systems that will allow for the supplemental payments. We know that those systems are going to take some time, even with all of the supports of the council and sort of smoothing the road. There are just a bunch of steps that are required, and we know that we want to do it well, which means making sure that the data is right and making sure that people have the proper information and all of that. So realistically, it is going to take time. That said, I think the report is really clear on the task force strong recommendation that ECE move as expeditiously as possible, which again, I think Sarah has been really clear is their commitment to do. The second element of this that I want to name, that we tangentially discussed but didn't really land on, is if it takes, depending upon how much time it takes to stand up that system, if it is really close to the end of this fiscal year, then would the task force recommend actually straddling fiscal years with this initial set of payments such that they could be split up into multiple installments because of this general concern. So I wanted to just name that is the one kind of particularly substantive issue that that has come up in the feedback in recent days that I do not think is addressed, you know, as directly in the report as I think some people think that it should be. All the other feedback has been more about emphasizing things, clarifying things, and that's all been incorporated, and I think reflects the feedback of the group. So let me stop there, see if people have reactions to that particular issue before we talk further about where we are on approving this report.
Since, oh,
Sorry, I was on mute. Marla, and then Tazra.
So first, let me say that I think the report reflects accurately the deliberations we've had and where we are. That is also to acknowledge that I think we, or many of us, still have points of concern, or at least cautionary tale, that give us some pause. And so I really want to talk about this in the sense of multiple hats that probably all of us wear, and just things that have been floating around in my mind since I read the report in its entirety. First, you know, Abigail, I sent you an article from EdSearch, just talked about the greater educational landscape, how it is really poised, not in just early childhood, because it really wasn't focused on that, but it was focused in K-12 for a great resignation in education due to a lot of factors. And I think I've raised that as a concern previously because there's not a lot of flexibility in the roles of educator. And we know that one of the things that's really driving workforce choices is flexibility. So we kind of have that big backdrop going on in the back of our minds, and or the context of this. And so I really want to talk in like three buckets. Equity. As an equity advocate, I really want to, yes, get dollars in the hands of the workforce. I want to be very concerned about the impact getting those dollars, or how we get them, are on such things as benefits cliffs, most specifically health benefits, especially in the age of COVID, where that is a very real and daily struggle. As a former leader in Early Childhood Center as a provider, I also know that I would also be staying up at night wondering if we gave these lump sums, would people say, you know, it's been a tough 2 years and I'm going to take some time to take like an extended mental health break, and then I have a shortage of staff. And then I think about as a taxpayer, that if I wasn't really engaged in this conversation, but heard that the city had invested X millions of dollars, and now I'm looking for a provider and I can't find anywhere to put my child in childcare because there's been this kind of exit from the workforce, because people rightfully and justifiably need some mental health breaks after a trip. You know, we've all experienced it. I don't need to go over it. How would I feel about those dollars being spent? So my concern, to put it in a nutshell, is I really think if we're going to go for multiple payments, which makes a lot of sense to me, but really puts the workforce in jeopardy of losing their health benefits, many people, that we have to figure out this healthcare piece. Because I think that's the way forward to do the least harm and to address all the unintended consequences that we are aware of at this point.
Thank you, Marla. And I do just want to note that the benefits piece and the healthcare piece, which we touch on in this report, we've noted is a topic for the second report. So it's I just want to sort of clarify that. Tazra.
Hi, I just quickly on the healthcare piece, I spoke to some national experts on Medicaid who work at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities today. And just for the stipend program, a lump sum payment is actually better at protecting people's Medicaid because there is a federal exemption for 1 month lump payments. That's considered as monthly income, but thereafter it's considered a resource. So just with respect to Medicaid, it actually protects people more if it's a one lump sum payment. I know that doesn't address any of the retention concerns that this body has, but I just wanted to speak to a question. I just want to make sure that my understanding is correct. Given that the funding was placed into a non-lapsing fund, if the 2022 pot of money that's slated for payments, it actually goes out in fiscal year 23, that's like the money, if it's not spent by the end of fiscal year 2022, it'll automatically go to 23, correct? Rather than like a surplus. I just want to make sure that if the money doesn't get out in a timely way by the end of the fiscal year, that it's not like reverting back to the fund balance.
Yeah, I think that is it's a $54 million question. And I think it's a really important question. Theoretically, it's a non-lapsing fund. I mean, it is a non-lapsing fund. So theoretically, funds can be carried over. That said, I don't know enough to speak to what the risk is of reprogramming those dollars and then potentially losing them. So I think it's a very real question, and others may have more to speak to that. Sally.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. There is a concern. I think it's also true that we can't necessarily predict what folks are going to do. I mean, I know I mentioned to you, Abigail, we might have to consider who's actually left standing when this program is put into place. I mean, people are leaving now, just, the stress of COVID, the stress of the job. It's as Marla said, we don't need to rehash this story because we're all living through it. But I also think that, and Christina touches on this in a comment that she made in the chat, we have to be really clear how this is communicated, not only to the educators, but to the community at large. We have to be very thoughtful about what this program is short-term, what the program means long-term, so that taxpayers understand, so that the council understands, so that the business owners understand, so that the educators understand, so that the program directors understand. We have to, let's look back at history, what pre-K did. They had a very comprehensive communications program, to talk about this program so that everybody understood it, so that everybody was speaking the same language about this program. And I think that can also help potentially, encourage some folks to hang on. Here, you're going to get some funds, and this is a part of a longer term program to support and financially pay you what you should be getting paid. So again, I think really thinking about how that communication piece can really support what we're doing also.
Thanks, Sally. Is that a hand from before, Marla?
I take it down. I'm so sorry.
Okay. Are there other are there other reactions to this particular issue? And I'll note that currently in the report, in a couple of places, we know that one, retention again overall is a priority. It's something that's important, in this work. It's part of why we're looking to increase compensation, and that the idea of spreading out payments over multiple installments, notwithstanding the point that Tezra made, which I think is a certainly important factor, that spreading them out in some ways also better approximates what the long-term mechanism will be, which is built into people's regular paychecks. So there's potentially that that advantage as well, and there are potentially limitations, both in terms of the amount of time it's going to take to stand up this program and the fiscal year overlap. So again, those issues are noted currently in the report, but I just wanted to put this out there to get a sense from the group about whether there needs to be stronger language in there, and including whether there's even the exploration of moving between fiscal years, or at least assessing that risk, and maybe the question that the question around whether we end up losing the dollars, obviously that is that's a salient question, and if that were the case, I think that the task force has been very clear that that's not an option. But any other thoughts on that before I open it up to any comments people want to make before we vote on the report? And I see a question in the chat around whether there could be an option for a teacher to choose a lump sum or monthly to protect public benefits. And that's obviously getting into the weeds in terms of what this might look like with a vendor. We have a lot of recommendations for what ASI should consider in identifying a vendor in the report. Perhaps a surfeit of recommendations, but certainly that's one that we could ask more about. I think that what I'm going to take from this right now is, again, we've noted this concern in the report already. We've noted the the importance of trying to move as quickly as possible, which is not news to Sarah and ASI. I do think that that we could look further into the question about what the impact might be in crossing over from fiscal years, but I certainly don't think we want to put a recommendation in without being confident that that is not going to result in lost funds, because we would certainly want to do that eyes wide open. So my recommendation is, unless we can determine that in the next 24 hours, that we keep the recommendation as it is, where we've noted this concern, but are not directing our recommendation, to specifically address the fiscal year issue until we know more about that. And should we get that information, we can come back to the group and clarify that in our second report. So if anyone has, thinks that does not sound right based on what people are saying, please speak out. But what I'd love to do now is, before we formally vote on this particular report, which again is due on the 15th, I want to give anyone who wishes a chance to just publicly comment on their degree of support, what if they, assuming that you're planning to vote yes, anything you want to say. If you are planning to vote no, giving any clarity on that. People aren't required to share that, but would love to give people the opportunity to do that if you would like. And Raleigh, just want to make sure you saw that note that Cynthia needs to be moved in.
Hi, Cynthia, if you're able to hear me, so I promoted you to panelist, so you just have to click accept. So once you click accept, you'll be able to be panelist.
Perfect. Okay, so let me open the floor to any comments that people would like to share before we take a vote on this first report. All right, and welcome, Cynthia. Tazra.
Sure, I just wanted to say a few remarks on behalf of Rakaya, since she wasn't able to be here. Thanks for allowing me to stand in for her. This is sort of related to what you all just discussed, but she just wanted to communicate that she hears folks' concerns and has some about attrition, but she is hopeful that through getting the sequencing right and through really good messaging and technical assistance to early educators that we can reduce turnover as much as possible. Another flag that we just wanted to raise is that, you know, if you look at the intent of the Birth to 3 Act, compensation wasn't just about pay, it was about pay and benefits. And that is not addressed in this report. And I would really love to see in the next report really dig into what compensation means. And, you know, I'm a realist. I can appreciate that there is a limited pot of money, but I don't think that we've really interrogated what compensation truly means as it relates to what's already in the law. So I just want to put that on record. Hopefully we can interrogate that a bit more and try to think through that. And then lastly, we do hope that the report will be translated in Spanish. And I just wanted to ask that before turning off the mic. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And on that last point, I'm punting that to Raleigh to add to her list. But I think we can assume the answer is yes. Sally and then Sarah.
Yeah, I just want to say that I do support this draft, and I do recognize that it is a work in progress, and I am very thankful that the council did extend our time, because I would hate to think that we were trying to make all of these decisions that we're talking about tonight by tonight. And you know, the hope is we want to get this right. You know, we can tell that our hearts are in this, and we don't want to make a mistake, because coming for me, you know, this is a change that I have, you know, I guess dreamed about for years. It is, you know, I got into this field not to get rich, obviously. But I got into it because of the effect that I see that it has on the young children, the ultimate outcome of what this program should be about. Highly compensated educators who are highly competent are going to have high quality outcomes for all young children. And that is going to be the building blocks of what happens throughout the rest of their life. And so I'm excited to be a part of this. Yes. Do we have challenges ahead of us? Yeah. I'm not being, you know, idealistic about that, but I think we've proven that we can work together, that we can agree to disagree, but that we all ultimately come to a conclusion that we think is best. And so I am hopeful. So I just want to have that on record.
I just wanted to say to Tazra's point that if assistance is needed with Spanish translation services, ECE is happy to help with that.
Thanks, Sarah. Walrick.
There we go. I was just going to say I'm supportive of the draft. I mean, I think that given the clear split between what this first report out versus the second will include, as well as the detail around sort of some of the outstanding issues or risks and unintended, I think that it captures, you know, a lot of what's been, or all of what's been highlights report still need to be
Thanks, Ulrich. Christina.
I just want to thank everybody for the work and the support that has gone into this report. These 2 last weeks for me have been crazy with the COVID hitting really, really hard. But I really I want to appreciate all the support that has been put into making this equitable and including all the license centers in the city, because we know that, you know, Black and brown are the higher number of people and taking care of the children. I really appreciate all the support and the detail that has gone into the report, making sure that we are included and the language access is going to be a reality. All the constituency that I represent here are very excited to hear what's going to happen. And I just do really hope that there are not, that the unintended consequences are not going to come and really impact our community, because as I mentioned before, you know, health, and I'm not going to go into that again, but it's something that it is very, very important, especially through all these pandemics. So thank you very much for your time, for including me, for inviting me. And I'm happy to be part of this group and put my little, you know, brain and making sure that all the people who are really putting a hard work into the education of their children are included.
Thanks, Christina. And I can assure you that your brain is not little. You bring a big brain to this. So I'm not seeing anyone else. I will give people a chance to chime in if they want. I will say just a couple of words myself now, which is, one, I want to just thank this group for digging into some really thorny issues and pushing through them, spending an immense amount of time to this point. And I know there's more to come, but in addition to these meetings, people doing, you know, reading outside of these meetings, additional small group conversations, the feedback that people have provided, there's just a lot of work that has gone into this. And certainly this report is not perfect, but I think it really reflects the wide range of experience and expertise in this group. So huge thank you to all of you for that. And I also just want to note that as much as we get into the weeds and we worry about these details, that what we are doing is groundbreaking. It is huge, and it's not just huge for DC, it is huge nationally, that we are poised to be, in the same way that DC has been a national leader in pre-K, we are poised to be a national leader in what this looks like in centers and child development homes, and educators working with infants and toddlers as well as pre-K age students. And I think that that we just need to take a moment to appreciate the power of what it is that we're working to do. And we know this is an issue of economics. We know it's an issue of child development, and we know it's an issue of equity around race and gender equity in particular, given our workforce. So it's a really big deal. And this step that we're taking is one of many, many steps that have come before it and that will come after it. But I just want everyone to appreciate the significance of this. So that's my brief soapbox. And Cynthia, I see your hand up, and Walrick, I don't know if that is your hand from before. If so, but if not, we'll come back to you after Cynthia.
Oh, hello, everyone. Yes, I just wanted to say that I am in support of the report, and this has been very, very, very a lot of work. Let me just say that. I'm happy that I finally are to feel inclusive with my colleagues is a big point, and a big place for family childcare to be among my colleagues, and discussing key issues like this is really, really I guess a blessing to our profession to be among our peers. And that's all we really wanted, is some level of equity across the board so that we can all care for children in a way that is of quality or a way that we can help families. I think that's what we all are set out to do. Also, too, I just want to make sure that I got on the record that family child care, we go by many titles, and I've said that plenty of times before. Just because I'm the owner director does not mean I'm not the main primary caregiver in our program. So we go by many names, but I just wanted to make sure that we said that, and it's also included in the report, of course. And I'm just really happy. I'm happy about what we turned out, and I'm happy that we're submitting something and not nothing. That just was one of my fears, that we didn't do anything, and I was worried. But I am in support of what we've put out so far, and look forward to working with the group on the long term.
Thank you, Cynthia. And thank you to Cynthia for continuing to hold our feet to the fire on making sure we are thinking across the whole landscape of settings, and that we are not leaving out a whole important piece of our sector. So appreciate that. So with that, I am going to move, and I know we haven't used any official, Robert's rules or anything in any of these meetings before, so I don't know if we need to now, but I will have us die hard. So I am going to move to approve this version of the report with the pending copy editing changes, that it will get one more scrub for clarity and typos, etc. But that from a substance point of view, we will not make further changes. So I guess shall we do just a show of hands, although not quite everyone's on. Or you can raise your little Zoom hand. How about that? Raise your little Zoom hand if you are supporting approval of this report. Oh, I forgot to raise my Zoom hand. Hold on. There we go. All right, and I don't see Marla's, but I know that she said before that she was on board. So unless I hear from you, otherwise, there we go. Okay. All right. Thank you all so much. And without further ado, let's get back to it, folks. So I'm going to share screen again. Okay, so as a number of people have already noted, there are some particular things that that we know we have not addressed, at least not in the detail that people want to make sure we address them. And so I've highlighted here 4 topics that I think are on that list. There are certainly other more specific things that people raised in this last report that we we may want to expand upon, but I wanted to note these big categories that are really core to the charge that we have for us. So the first is the one that we've already begun to talk about, which is experience as a factor in the salary scale. So we were asked to develop a salary scale that was differentiated by role, credential, and experience. We have looked at those first 2 categories, but we've not landed on where we are on that 3rd category of experience. So that's the first. The second is in thinking about the long-term mechanism. So the mechanism that gets funds to childcare facilities child development facilities that have opted in. What should that funding formula for payments keep in mind? So the specifics and the details of the formula obviously are going to be in the weeds and things that OSSI is going to have to, figure out based on a whole bunch of factors. But we want to be able to give our guidance and recommendation as to what is going to be important to factor in and consider in that formula, what should be prioritized, what should not be prioritized, or we think shouldn't be a part of it. So that we will get to a little bit down the line. And then related to that is the approach to, and I have contracting in quotes because it may be a contract and maybe something else, but the essentially the agreements that will be developed with facilities to participate in the pay equity fund. Again, what do we want OSSI to prioritize and consider in establishing these agreements? And so we've talked about some of that a little bit, but what will that look like for providers that currently have subsidy agreements, for example, versus ones that don't? Are there different ways that that we might think about that? How's that approach going to work? And then benefits, which has come up in this conversation already. I know it is a deep concern among this group. So one, thinking about, we've recognized that compensation is, salary is a portion of compensation, but it is not all of compensation. And thinking about how the different elements of compensation play out with respect to benefits. What additional recommendations do we have? And acknowledging that this is a huge, huge issue. We've talked some about the public benefits issues, particularly around benefits cliffs, the challenges that exist given that our workforce lives in multiple jurisdictions. So we've got Maryland, Virginia, and DC folks, and that plays out differently on that front. We also have existing programs in the district that may play a role in some of the benefits pieces, including the our leave program that has recently been implemented. So there are a whole lot of questions there, and I think we're going to need to figure out what are the things that we think need to be prioritized, and where do we think that ongoing work should live. Do we have recommendations around that? So those are the big topics. I want to just, before we jump into the experience topic, I want to just open the floor to see, are there other high level topics that you think are not on this list that you think need to be? So again, I don't want to get too in the weeds about like specific details, but if there are, broader topics, I want to make sure we've captured them.
This may be a question more than anything. Will the second report dive a little bit deeper into credentials?
That is a good question, Marika. And I would say it's not explicit in our charge, but obviously it is related to the salary scale clearly. So I guess I would say that's something that the task force can talk more about if it feels like that is a critical path issue, or whether that's something that is not, that's not in our lane and that maybe needs to live somewhere else. So yeah, I mean, I guess I would say our filter for that should be, to what degree does it feel, critical path to the implementation of the salary scale? And if so, are there some recommendations that come from that? Anything else that people want to make note of here?
I just wanted to, can you make it clear a little bit about the credentials piece? Because I'm a little confused. I know it goes to the salary scale, but I'm a little confused about the question.
Do you want to speak to what you were thinking, Marika?
Sure. I mean, I know that just getting there's some ambiguity around what credentials are required, equivalencies, the grandfathering process, and given that the second report will dive a little bit deeper into scales based on credential, is there room just to get a little bit of clarity there?
Thanks, Marika. And I see in the chat, Sarah has offered that there will be opportunities for discussions of credentials through OSSI's revision of the licensing regulations, as well as the SEC DCC. So that might be something that we can get a little more information about from Sarah in terms of how that might fit into this timeline and whether some of this could essentially get added to their list, so that you all are through your process making sure you're addressing questions that have come up.
And quick plug, our January 26th SEC DCC meeting is going to be 100% about workforce issues, featuring our esteemed chair as a special guest, as well as representatives of the programs that support professional advancement for the workforce. So Marika, I hope that you'll be there, but I wanted to share that for folks since it may also share some useful information for some of the things the task force has talked about.
Excellent. Put it on your calendars, people. SEC DCC, you want to be there. Okay, and then the other thing that that I'm realizing is sort of a supporting issue in all of this, but that you raised earlier, Sally, is the sort of overall public communication question, and whether there are some recommendations around that are kind of undergird everything. So they're maybe not their own separate thing, but I just wanted to note that, and we can add that to this list as well. All right. Do people need a quick stretch break before we get into experience? I feel like I usually feel so pressured that I never even give that option, but why don't we take a 2-minute stretch break? I actually need to get some water, and then we will come back in at 6:55. All right, welcome back, everybody. Hopefully that was long enough for you to do what you needed to do. All right, let's jump into the experience question. So what I'm going to share first. So this is straight out of the report that we just approved. Just to frame the experience question. So again, part of our charge explicitly from the task force legislation was to create a pay scale that was differentiated based on role, on credential, and on experience. And so we did those first two. now are turning to the experience piece. And want to note that we obviously recognize that experience is an important factor. It is a significant part of talent management in terms of acknowledging the value of that experience, and that it is more complicated than the factors of role and credential, which is why we need some extra time to look at it. Part of that is, with over 300 employers operating as independent businesses and nonprofits, no standard way of defining relevant experience and limited centralized data on experience. There's just more significant burden on providers to both get all that data, but also on the accountability front. And we also recognize that the costs to implement an experience element of the scale would most likely be more than existing funds can support. Although, we obviously our projections are rough on all of this, so we don't know exactly what those numbers would look like. But our assumption is that the experience piece would probably push us over the top. So that again just adds a level of challenge to this. So that's sort of the framing of where we are. You all may remember a few weeks ago, I don't know, pre-Omicron, so it was like forever ago, you all did a survey that included this question: how would you recommend addressing experience as a factor in setting salaries under the new system, to just try and start to get some of the perspectives of task force members on this. So what I've done is I've organized folks' comments into a few different categories, kind of considerations and approaches that we might think about. So all of the examples on here are straight from your all's mouths, proverbially speaking, but I've just kind of drawn out some of the characteristics. So first is the approach one that is at one end of the spectrum providing guidelines, and at the other end of the spectrum very strict requirements? So would we lean towards having our child development facilities have a recommended scale, for example, as this first example says, that may have caps and minimums, but would allow the facilities to determine where to place staff within that continuum. So more, more general guidelines. So you see a couple of examples of that on the left, versus an adherence to a much more, rigid scale. So without flexibility for employers to decide where we're on that. So that's one question of where on that continuum would we want to land. A second factor is, do you have something that is sort of wide bands versus detailed steps? So a couple of suggestions on the left here from folks where people said, for example, you'd have a step that is, 1 to 5 years experience, 6 to 10, something that's broad, where you would have those step increases, but it wouldn't be as granular. So a couple of examples on the left of that. On the right are examples that were with much more detailed steps. So the DCPS scale, the federal government scale are a couple of examples, and I have some information on both of those. This third example is just a flat 3% COLA for everybody with each year of experience, as another approach to doing that would be somewhat simpler, but still, at a more detailed level. Then there's a question of how we sequence pay scale implementation. So a number of you made comments around, well, what if we start with, once we implement the salary scale in the long-term mechanism, we start with just, all right, everybody's got to meet the minimum, and do that to begin with, and then in later iterations move towards including experience. So that's another question we'll want to think about is, how to sequence that. The example below provides an example, one possibility of how we might do that, that one of you suggested. So, starting out by taking the first year to provide, getting information on credential experience, go through a validation process, take the time to do that, then, start with the baseline pay and then move to, begin funding later on. So that's another thing that we'll want to just think about generally. So I want to give, a number of you have asked over time, well, how does ECPS do this? And how does the federal government do this? I don't want to get super into the weeds on this, which, we may do down the line, but I wanted to just give kind of a high level, what these examples look like so that people can have a sense of what that might mean if we were trying to do it in this arena. So at DCPS, salary for incoming teachers, so both teachers and aides, which is their term for their assistant teachers, is determined centrally by HR. So there's a function that's not at the school level, at the central level, and that's based on educational level and years of work experience. So there's a team that basically takes someone's information and determines, all right, you get this many years experience attributed to you based on your call it your transcript, that's not your CV. And then there's some specific things around teachers can be placed up to a maximum of step 10 upon their hire, for example. For aides, they can be put up to step 8 for their hire. So there's specifics around that, which again, you can get as detailed as you want. And so that's all for incoming salary. And then for salary increases, there are some expectations around how that works for teachers, and again, separate ones for aides. And part of it is that it is related to your evaluation. So DCPS has, their impact teacher evaluation. If you're effective or higher on that, then you're eligible for step increases. If you're not, you don't. So an evaluation is a central piece of the DCPS model, if we wanted to look at that as a model. And then there are rules around how you move up a step. So a step gives you a salary increase for the first, 11 years of experience. It's 1 step, 1 year. After that, it's 4 years. All of this is negotiated in the DCPS contract. So these details are specific to that. So it gives you an idea of the kinds of things that are considered. The federal government has in some ways a similar system, although there are some additional restrictions. So new hires begin at step 1 of whatever their grade is, although you can negotiate for beyond that. So there's a process for doing that. The grades are adjusted each year across the board. So the essentially sort of COLA increases. And then there are steps, again, similar to DCPS, although different rules in terms of how long it takes you to move from one step to the next. So sometimes it takes you a year, sometimes it takes you 2 years, sometimes it takes you 3 years. And again, it's based in part on evaluation. So these, these are at the more detailed end of that spectrum, more, requirements, not guidelines, specific things that have to be met. So wanted to just provide that for people, since that was something that a lot of folks had asked. This is thank you, Marika, for sharing this as a concept, but this would be an example of, the wider bands that are not as detailed, where you would say, all right, step 1 is if you're in that 0 to 5 range, step 2, 6 to 10. Again, these are all just examples of the ways that you might think about it. You all may remember that as part of the scale that we have already proposed now, and specific to the language in the pay equity fund, there is an expectation of a COLA, of how those salaries move up over time, that's linked to CPI. So that is already built into the pay equity fund. It increases over the years, but this would be separate in terms of experience. So it's not just that everybody moves up because of inflation. It's you get experience bumps at various points. So I know that was a lot of information, but I wanted to just sort of lay out some of the factors that we might think about, and I want to just open up the discussion around at least starting with these guiding questions, although people can chime in on whatever. So what level of flexibility do we think individual employers should have in what we're talking about here? So sort of the guidelines versus requirements, where on that spectrum do we think makes the most sense? And then how detailed should the experience scale be? Do we want to, have some of those sort of wider bands, or do we want to look at this for, every year? And then the sequencing of implementation. So part of that, again, is a dollars question. We may not have enough money in the pay equity fund to fully fund what we end up recommending in year one. So there just literally may be that challenge that council needs to then, the council and the mayor would need to address. But also there's just a question of effectiveness of implementation. Are there, what steps do we need to take along the way to do this well, and how might we think about sequencing that? And then just what else feels important to name in how we recommend incorporating experience over time. So I'm going to stop talking and stop sharing my screen, and open the floor to people's thoughts and reactions to this, so that we can begin shaping what we think needs to be prioritized on the experience front.
Yeah, this is just for clarity. The salary scales we're establishing sets the minimum salary, meaning an employer can pay more than the minimum. Okay.
Kathy and then Sarah.
Do we have an idea of what implementation would cost? Since cost is one of the factors. I mean, do we have a ballpark?
I'm going to punt that to Sarah.
Thanks, Abby. To Marika's point, my inclination would be that if that's something the task force believes is important, it's probably something that should be included in the task force's report and recommendations rather than assumed in terms of what a salary scale means. I'm not sure it is necessarily obvious that a salary scale would set a minimum rather than mandating a uniform pay across multiple employers. So I think from our perspective, if we were implementing it and needing to enforce it, we would need clarity on that ourselves. I think to Kathy's point, we've talked about this quite a bit. There are a number of open questions that we need more information on in order to accurately project the potential costs, including current compensation levels and experience. One of the things we would seek to do through the initial phase of implementation that you all just voted on the first report about would be to collect some information that would help improve our ability to project some of those things. We could then use our cost model in a way that we can use our cost model to project costs in a variety of scenarios, but we need to have assumptions about what current experience levels and current compensation are in order to know what the difference in cost would be.
Is it helpful to get some of this information sooner rather than later from programs? You know, rather than waiting for a scale to be developed, but do we ask for some data, you know, right off the bat, end of January, we need to start collecting this data? Would that be helpful to get some information rather than kind of what, you know, I know we're hoping to get some data as, you know, folks will start opting into this first short-term mechanism, but could we start asking for data? I mean, you know, some of the forms already do ask for it.
We have the data that we currently have from programs that currently require that information. We could start asking for that information. However, we don't have any lever to compel anyone to provide that information. So any picture we got would be heavily biased by who chose to give us information, which is a consideration because you could imagine there may be some reasons that the providers we have information on already because they participate in certain programs, or providers that would choose to share their information may be different in meaningful ways from providers who don't participate in those programs or who wouldn't share that information voluntarily.
Other thoughts, and I did just drop the questions in the chat. Thank you for that suggestion, Tazra, so people can see. But other thoughts that people have on, you know, how we think about this approach. Again, this is, you know, there are all kinds of sort of operational challenges and questions of program autonomy and all of that. And I want to get a sense from this group around what feels you know, what feels most important and what feels like it will speak to the priorities around recognizing experience, but also support our goals around implementation, you know, the degree to which guidance versus requirement, all of that. I'd love to just hear people's thoughts on what matters.
So when it comes to my mind, and I'm sorry I didn't raise the hand, but you know, in terms of sustainability for those programs that might have a lot of folks that have been in the business for years, and you know, how it's going to impact you know, small programs who been working for years with the same providers. And I'm just, you know, thinking through how would that impact into the sustainability in the long term. I know we want to attract a lot of new people, and obviously the good salary would bring a lot of new workforce into early childhood education. But also we want to balance it out and maintain our workforce that are more experienced. But for example, in our program, we have a lot of retention for people who've been working for us with many, many years. So I will, you know, in terms of like paying them in a scale where they will fall into it, it's just a little bit mind-boggling to me, and I think it's different for every, you know, school center, home, you know, development center. So.
Thanks, Christina. And are you? I want to make sure I'm understanding what you're saying. I mean, I think part of what I'm hearing is, you know, depending upon the distribution of experience in a particular center, that it could skew it could skew, significantly in one direction or another. I mean, the way that school districts, can manage that is to have these average teacher salaries, and it's all centralized. And so if you have a teacher that has a whole lot more experience, that's not coming out of your school's, budget in some way, right? You're allocated the number of teachers, but you're not, you don't have to worry if you've got one that's way more experienced and so is a much more expensive teacher. In other situations, obviously, if you have your own budget and there's nobody kind of covering you on that, then the incentive financially is to hire less experienced teachers because they cost less, right? If you have to pay. And obviously that's a complicated issue when it comes to this decentralized market. So anyway, I don't know if that's partly what you're getting at, but I want to make sure I'm understanding your issue.
I mean, and maybe I don't. I mean, is this money is going to be forever? I mean, is it going to cover? So once everything is implemented, and oftentimes there are beautiful requirements, but then schools or centers are oh, sorry, there is no more money for this, but then you are left with these huge requirements that you have to meet. So unintended consequences, then you have to balance, and it's just too complicated. You want to keep your teachers that are wonderful and have years of experience, but can you afford it in the long term?
Got it. So there's a sustainability question that you want to make sure that we're really clear on. That makes total sense to me. Sally.
Yeah, so I mean, this is probably going to be one of our toughest topics. So we are talking about, so part of this funding formula, that there will be an expectation that programs will have to pay, let's just say for an assistant teacher with a CDA, let's just start with that. There is going to be an expectation that there will be any program that opts into this will have to pay at this amount, and then this fund will supplement that salary to get to what the salary scale. I guess that's maybe.
Yeah, so this gets into how the funding formula would be built. And right now, we don't know. Sarah probably has some ideas that she's starting to.
So I guess for me, that's why it would be like really helpful, even if not everybody would give information. But I mean, that again could be, part of the education community reaching out to our constituents and saying, this is why we need this information, right? It is to help develop this. And I think we could at least get some snapshot of what's going on in the city. But I think, without kind of trying to figure this out without some actual real data to kind of bounce around and fit it in there, I think we're just going to kind of be scrambling. So I think, maybe trying to get some, it's not going to be perfect initially, but I think as much data as we could get initially so that we can make better informed, I guess, choices, I would find it excessively helpful.
Thanks, Sally. And Cynthia, I see your question about subsidy. So the subsidy dollars is a separate pot of money from this pay equity fund pot of money. Obviously, because money is fungible, where you're directing the dollars, may sort of mix essentially with subsidy dollars in terms of how you're, spending those funds. Yeah, and again, this gets to the formula issue, because the formula, would likely take into account your various sources of revenue. So in that way, there's some interconnection. Yeah, I mean, I feel like the questions people are raising, which are really good questions, speak to the fact that the funding formula is well, A, is going to be really important to figure out, but B, has an impact on these other issues, including on the experience piece. So I recognize that we may need to iterate between these two topics because they certainly affect each other.
Abigail, I just wanted to know, do we actually know, is that going to be the only funding stream? Because I'm trying to figure out the funding stream. So if we're coming up with these positions and these titles, one funding stream, of course, is the task force piece, where they'll have their the money to raise the amounts. That's the 53 million or whatever that's going to be. And then we have the subsidy. I'm looking to see what all these streams are, because if I'm a private person that does not have subsidy, what would that look like for me? Would I just only get funds from the one stream that's over there to help me substitute this income for someone? Because I'm just a little confused about that. I'm like, how are these funding streams, or is it forcing private pay to come into the subsidy system, or encourage them to come into the subsidy system so they can get more funds to help with salaries for their staff? But if they choose not to do that, then I don't, I'm just worried about people being penalized because they didn't decide to choose subsidy.
Yeah, I think that concern about not penalizing providers that choose not to do subsidy. I mean, certainly we've been clear that the pay equity fund dollars are available independent of subsidy participation. So I think that we've been really clear about. Whether there's, going to be ongoing incentives, whether people feel like it would sweeten the deal or would make their financial situation more manageable. I don't know that we know that yet. So I don't want to, dismiss that. We certainly obviously don't want we don't want fewer subsidy providers, just given the need. But I don't think that's something that this would necessarily, push towards either. I don't know if you have any other thoughts about how we think about the subsidy piece, Sarah. And again, I know this is a whole another topic, but to the extent that it'd be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've discussed previously the notion that currently every child development facility has a set of revenues it has based on what it gets from subsidy and or what it gets from parent payments, and in some cases from philanthropic funding sources or federal grants or PKEEP or something else. And that in most cases, those funds are not enough money to pay teachers and assistant teachers or staff at the levels that would be comparable to what we want to see for the field. So the idea is that this money would come in on top of other funding streams in order to help people meet that level. I believe that's what we've discussed previously. The details of how that works are very complicated. And I think exactly what it's so fortunate that we have this task force of people who really understand childcare business in a variety of different operating contexts, no subsidy participation, mostly subsidy participation homes, centers, participating in PKEEP, participating in Head Start, all of those kinds of things that can help us think better about this.
Ezra.
But if anything, wouldn't it discourage greater participation in subsidies? If subsidies aren't currently covering the full cost and this money would come in. So I don't know if we can actually say that this isn't going to hurt greater subsidy participation rate, right? Well, that just might be like a bigger debate than what we need to have right here, but I'm concerned about subsidy kids and like what ripple effects this will have, but that's like a conversation that I can have offline. I do feel like it is hard, like to Sally's point, just looking at like specific guidelines versus strict requirements. I think it's really hard to figure out what a good philosophy to have if there isn't like the data. because and if we don't know what share of the minimum providers would have to cover, it's like because you could think about it like on average. Well, I think this actually wouldn't be great because of the recession, but thinking about like current revenue levels and wanting to hold folks harmless, or you could do like pre-COVID enrollment levels. I'm not sure how you would want to do it, but you'd have to take into account like how you want to hold harmless some folks who have higher than average salaries than others. And without having any of that data, it makes it hard to try to like map out scenarios around how the more specific guidelines would play out versus the strict requirements. So I agree with Sally, even if the data is incomplete, just having some data with a bunch of caveats is better than making some of these decisions in the dark.
Thanks. And I think the data point is well taken. I want to hear Marika and Taryn. I also want to just throw out, even assuming, I want people to also think in terms of like aspirationally. So if you could wave your magic wand and all the money was there and everything was all ready to go and implementation was not an issue, what do you actually think a smart approach to experience in the pay scale would look like? So there then obviously needs to be, all right, could we get there and how long would it take us to get there and what else do we, so I'm not saying that we necessarily will get to our aspirational, certainly not right away. But I think these questions that I'm raising are not just about what's possible right now, but what would we even want? What is our ideal situation? And I think that there are different opinions about that. And I want to get a sense of where you all fall. Marika and then Taryn.
Yeah, I think while we're talking about the potential effects on subsidy, I think we should also not forget PKEEP. I'm still a little fuzzy about PKEEP as it relates to this, particularly since we have excluded PKEEP from receiving the bonuses and or salary. And just given the fact that in some cases, the PKEEP programs have funding for 10 months versus 12 months if they have summer school. This may reflect my lack of knowledge about the PKEEP program. I own that, but I just want to also put PKEEP back on the table as we're talking about the impact on subsidy. And as far as trying to determine the share of the minimum that this resource can support, being very careful about not penalizing programs that have been able to pay more. So we don't create a system where providers end up paying minimum wage or close to minimum wage because they know they can get a higher reimbursement amount to fill the gap between what they're currently paying and what this funding offers.
Yeah, I wanted to, a couple of thoughts. I know the conversation's going a few different directions. I'm a data person, so I'm all for data. Although I think the point about creating incentives or not creating incentives for programs to decrease wages or to pay minimum wage, it could be adjusted somewhat in the way that the grants were, the formula that we're thinking about. So, and potentially a subsidy too. You could think about a program or a formula that assumes a certain wage, maybe like a base wage that's minimum wage for everybody. And then the grant bumps that wage up to get to the minimum level that the scale or the compensation scale requires, but then adjusted for many factors, whether it's subsidy or percent of children on subsidy, to try to encourage participation, whether it's like I know Connecticut has used their ARPA funds for stabilization grants that are adjusted by the social vulnerability index. And so it's a measure of, I think it's at the census tract level. So something like that could be used to so that not everybody gets the same, but it's like a base formula, and then it's bumped up depending on different levels that you want to encourage or provide more funds for. But then in that way, it's somewhat independent of what the program was paying previously as well. And so again, I'm all for data, and I think it's really important to know that, but I don't know if that's where the metric needs to be set, if that makes sense, in the formula. And then on the experience point, I think we just broadly, I think we want to be cognizant of designing a system that encourages experience and credentials, right? We want stability, we want retention. We know that's really important on so many levels for everybody. And then designing that with credentials and encouraging credentials in mind too, so that both are kind of part of the system, and that there's not these strange incentives to where it levels off when you reach a certain credential or experience or something like that. So just thinking through those kinds of cut points in a scale, I think it's important. So anyway, that was a lot of thinking out loud.
Cynthia.
Since we already on this section and we're having all this parity with DCPS, I wonder if this will also address on the back end with subsidy in regards to the pay inequities that's there, so that we all can be able to afford. Because if I'm still getting paid far less than my counterparts, and I'm still with that fund to be willing to, if there is still an inequity in subsidy, is it going to substitute that at that difference to make sure that I can still pay for my staff if there's going to be, or are we considering the equity across the board for our subsidy? We all get paid the same thing, so we can all pay out the same thing, even based on experience and role that you play in the program and your credentials.
Thanks, Cynthia. I know this is an ongoing question and issue around how subsidy, what subsidy rates are by setting. So appreciate you raising it. Obviously, it's it's complicated in terms of how it interacts with this question, but it's an important point. Other reactions. I mean, let me just be a little bit more provocative here, because I feel like we're dancing around the edges a little bit. So the pay scale, for example, that ECE put out per the requirement of the Birth to 3 Act was asked to specifically mimic the DCPS pay scale, which it did. And so it has all of those different steps, and with the same assumptions about increases the DCPS makes. There's certain things that it doesn't have that that would be part of that parity, including, for example, the requirement around evaluation. But full parity, that it might have that too. And the systems are very, very, very different, as we've talked about. So the process for calculating experience up front looks in a particular way in DCPS. If it were, again, if we were just mimicking it, then ECE would be setting up a whole division to assess people's experience coming into their roles, which, maybe we want to recommend, might make Sarah, head spin around. The level of, sort of expectation around requirements for DCPS is very specific. A principal cannot say, well, I've got a little extra money, I'm going to pay you a little bit more. Like, that's not allowed. And you have to meet, there's no discretion. Again, maybe that's something that we think makes sense in this context. Maybe it doesn't. Like, I want to sort of push people a little bit of, these are very different models that we could be proposing, where we say, all right, here's a minimum, and here's some guidance around how you reward experience. Do with it what you will. Or we say, we're going to come and check, and is this 3 years? Do you meet the definition of 3 years of experience? Do you have this exact salary? and we got to set up a process for making sure that people are being held to that. So again, I'm just trying to kind of provoke a little bit of like what some of these decision points are to see if we can, get a little bit more input. So Cynthia, Sarah, Sally, or Cynthia, that might have been the old hand. I'm not sure. All right, Sarah and then
Old hand.
okay.
I was just thinking to this point, we know that there are no other states that have implemented parity compensation across their entire early childhood mixed delivery system, but there are some other states that have implemented pay parity in pre-K publicly funded that includes community-based organizations at different points in time. And there may be things from how some other states have phased those in that would be helpful for us to look at, or in terms of how they actually define parity across different contexts that may be different from how we've done it in our pre-K program, but could be helpful as we think about what it looks like to extend to a broader mixed delivery system, that we might be able to learn useful things from, New Jersey. I think there are a few other states. So that might be something that would help the task force just get some ideas for like, what could this look like and what does it take as we move forward with some of the other conversations here.
Sally.
So I'm going back to your kind of aspirational question. And I think, going back to what the Birth to Three Act was asking for was a salary scale that was, put early educators in parity with DCPS. And to whatever degree we can follow that, I think we should. I mean, I think otherwise we're doing a disservice, and I think we need to figure out how I think there needs to be some accountability around experience, just like we're expecting accountability around people's credentials. We're not just going to take it on face value that, oh, I've got a master's in this, and I'm just going to say, okay, yeah, you have a master's. I would want to see, like your transcripts and things like that. So, but I don't think we should be selling ourselves short. We didn't sell ourselves short in the short term, and I don't think we should be selling ourselves short in the long term. And to the best of our ability to figure out how we could meet this salary scale, and as Sarah said, we might have to phase it in because just for whatever it's gathering data or what's going to work best for this mixed delivery system. But I don't think we should sell ourselves short, and we should be as aspirational as possible.
Thanks, Sally. And I see a couple of comments in the chat, Marika, the point around experience in the field versus experience in a current role, which is one of the factors to consider. Other reactions. So Sally is saying that, in her ideal world, we have a detailed salary scale that sets requirements that that every provider who opts in must follow. So without the what's the word I'm looking for? The ability to sort of make judgments at a particular facility, that this is something that would come down. If you opt in, then the full salary scale. Is that where other folks are? Are there other things that people think that we should consider? Marla.
I have a question for Sarah. So I know that ECE controls credentialing for DCPS, meaning there's some level of oversight and involvement and determination that happens at that level. But do they actually control where DCPS places people on the salary scale? So, or is that internal process to DCPS? So like DCPS says, yeah, we're going to we have a new hire and we're going to bring that person in at step 5, and ECE doesn't have to sign off on that, I don't believe. I think that's an internal. So I think credentialing and salary steps are handled. ECE's involvement in that is very different, if I understand this correctly.
ECE licenses teachers through the Division of Teaching and Learning. I am not intimately familiar with how teachers in DCPS are placed on the salary scale within DCPS. What I want to note is that DCPS is a single employer, and they have a union contract with their employees as a single employer that defines many of these things, including their salary scale. And the challenge in trying to implement one set of common standards in this early childhood context is that there are very many employers. And so if we wanted to try to define very clear steps related to experience, and we wanted that to be consistent across employers, that is just a different set of considerations than for one employer in DCPS.
So I get that, but I'm really trying to get at the level of involvement and oversight in DCPS making those decisions. But and secondly, it's one thing to ensure that people are meeting the minimal standard. It's another thing to say that you cannot place somebody on a salary scale that's more. So I guess I'm trying to understand how much flexibility we're going to give to the actual employer, because I don't believe that ECE is involved in that granular level of decision making with DCPS. So
I think that is the value question that Abby's trying to put before the task force right now.
Yeah, no, I think that's, I mean, I would love your thought on that, Marla, because I mean, you're right. The analogy isn't all quite right, because ECE does not make those particular decisions for DCPS, but DCPS does make those decisions for its 100 schools centrally. So any individual school does not have discretion, and those decisions are, as Sarah said, based on a collectively bargained contract. So the question is, how much flexibility do you think individual childcare providers should or shouldn't have?
This is one thing. You were asking me a question, or are you just throwing it out there?
No, I'm asking you.
Go ahead. No, you go.
Yeah, because I think it's an important question.
Right. So I know that ECE doesn't involve themselves in where DCPS places individual teachers on the salary scale. What I believe is two different questions we're trying to, in some ways, combine or conflate. One is ECE willing to pay for a higher placement on the salary scale or not, which is different than, which I think is one way of framing this, versus do we need to say you must put somebody on a certain salary level? Because let's just say that as a provider, ECE says, well, we're going to pay at this level. And then you as a provider have the flexibility to say, no, I actually want to put this person on this salary scale. I think that's different than being completely restrictive and saying you must do this. So I don't know. That's kind of where my preliminary thoughts around this are.
Tazra, Walrick, Cynthia, Christina. Now I finally got you guys going here. All right.
I'm still mulling over what I think is best, but I do want to just raise a question of, these are small businesses.
Right.
If at the middle or end of the fiscal year, if revenues aren't coming in at projections and we have to make budget cuts, that's one way salaries could be reduced for public school teachers. but say that like revenues aren't coming in at expectations for a small business, like a childcare provider, are they going to be expected to maintain the salaries? And I think that they should, but they should also get support from this district. So we could think about like what type of stabilization fund is needed in the first couple of years as we're experimenting with the rollout of a program. That way, teachers are still held harmless, but providers are getting supports they need in those first couple of years. Just a thought, if the task force is moving towards like a very strict salary scale.
All right.
Yeah, and I guess maybe just as I was, Marla had outlined. I mean, it sounds like effectively for DCPS, they're setting both the floor and there's no. There's a very strict salary scale that they have, and discretion is taken away. We basically is what we want to put forward. You're setting that. You're setting a floor, like this is what based on experience and this is what you should get at, but then you to the employer if they want to pay over and above that. So maybe that's my first question. The second is one that I just don't know the answer to, is what does that, if that's what we're saying, right, and what we're talking about is like not the discretion above, what does that flexible board, we have, and others, like we have centers, like what is that flexibility on the upside, like what does that actually afford you? And then
Thanks, Og. You were a little bit in and out there, but I think that your point was, the question of are we setting a floor and a ceiling, or just a floor? And then what flexibility does that, what does the flexibility afford individual employers?
That's right, on the ceiling side, like, right, because more you could pay more, but is it running these businesses, like, is it having that flexibility materially different, or is it more to be able to have clear transition and around pay and credentials, like, yeah, that's it.
Thanks, Warwick. And I'm seeing in Sally's note that programs should not go below the point on the salary scale for whatever the agreed upon amount is for experience and credentials, but they could go above it. So again, that's different than DCPS. I just want to be clear that it's an individual school. As much as they want to do that, they cannot do that. They cannot just say, I've got a little more money, I'm going to give Sally a bump up in the salary. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. I'm just saying that we got to be thoughtful when we say we want exactly what DCPS is. Like, I just want to be clear, like that would be one of the restrictions. Cynthia, Christina, Sarah.
I thought we were leaning to more on equivalency and not direct equity with them, because I'm a private business owner. And if I want to do and have that flexibility as a business owner to give my staff that flexibility, I don't want OSSI making that determination what I can and cannot do in my business. This is my choice, my decision. If I want to give them $2 extra, I think we need that flexibility there. And that should not be based on what OSSI makes the determination. OSSI can set the ground rules of where we decide to be at and what we're deciding on, but that should not be an OSSI decision to where I want to place my staff or to bump them down or anything like that. There are already a lot of inequities already in systems, and there's no reasoning behind the inequities. So I'm just a little worried about that.
Thanks, Cynthia. Christina.
Well, I'm just a little concerned because I agree we should have good salaries for early childhood education. I don't feel very comfortable when we talk about comparing to the CPS, because the requirements are not very equitable or very welcoming to minorities. And, you know, I think that we should be thinking about how we can also use some of those funds to really support our minority workers who've been in the field for a long time, to provide them with the necessary credentials to then get those high salaries, and not just attract new people to the field because we're going to pay better, but also how do we support those people who are already in the field to reach out those credentials. I will hate to see something like, oh, well, since we're going to do it like the CPS, now they need to be licensed and they need to pass a praxis, and that will totally bump all the equity in terms of our population and passing all those tests that are required by people who work for DCPS. So I would be very cautious in terms of us really trying to do things like DCPS, because we're a total, I mean, that's why probably OSI has two different entities running, you know, the two systems, right?
Sarah.
Yeah, I think I everything Christina says is always very smart, and I appreciate it, but I think I may be saying something aligned with her. I feel like in this conversation, we're dealing with just a tension between two values, one of which is the desire for consistency for employees across the system and predictability, and the other of which is the desire for autonomy or flexibility for employers to adjust to their own situations. And we can't guarantee perfect consistency for employees across the whole system and perfect autonomy for employers. So we need to decide how we balance those trade-offs. We've talked a lot about DCPS because the DCPS salary schedule is stated in the Birth to 3 Act, but I do think it's also worth noting that DCPS is, you know, about half of our educational system, and that in the charter sector, we do have other employers that set their own compensation scales, which still are expected to meet certain standards around, you know, transparency, predictability, fitting within their budget. But it is totally the case that, you know, if I am unhappy in my charter school that I work in, I may go look and see if there's another charter school whose pay is higher, even though I am the same person and have the same credentials. And different charter schools make different decisions about how they want to structure their salary schedules, how they want to balance the mix of, you know, what kinds of supports they provide for their staff and what the mix of compensation looks like. And that may be a model that makes more sense for this sector than looking at DCPS. Although it is also very different in other ways.
Marla.
Two things. Abigail, while it's true that, kind of true, the individual schools cannot set their own salaries, but DCPS as a single LEA can move you on that experience level scale. So if we think about each provider as like their own LEA, that's the more appropriate comparison than schools within LEA. So I just want to make sure we're making the correct comparison. And the reason why I say that is, so if you are a physics teacher in DCPS, you probably have some more negotiating power than some other teachers on the same salary scale with the same amount of years of experience. And I'm just being realistic. And, you know, so
I actually don't think that's true, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, they're not going to let too many physics teachers with that kind of shortage walk out the door. So I'm just, because there's just not a lot of them walking around on the earth. But I mean, so we just need to be making sure we're comparing apples to apple, and that's LEA to LEA. So DCPS as an LEA and each provider as an LEA, I think is the more appropriate.
So is that, so let me tease out what you're saying there. So, and again, like we're using DCPS and charters as sort of foils. So I don't want to get too wrapped up in, because at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what they do. It matters what we want to do. But let me just sort of draw out. So you are saying that you do think that individual employers in the early ed sector should be able to have flexibility to set salaries above a certain minimum. Is that what you're saying?
I am, but I also started to think about, I think it was Tesla who talked about stability fund in these first 2 years. I think that if you do go above and you make that decision, I'm not so sure if we land on a stability fund that you should be able to necessarily access that stability fund because you made a business decision to go above. So I know I'm leaping way down the line, but I'm just trying to bring all these thoughts of people that I'm hearing together.
Okay, so we are just about out of time here. Cynthia, was that I think that was an old hand?
Old hand.
Okay, so Anne, let me let you pipe in because we haven't heard your voice.
Thanks, Abby. I just had a question about if anybody knows, as we talk about DCPS, the childhood centers that are located in some of the high schools that are affiliated with DCPS, or if they're not, or if Centronia or others that are in the schools have pay scales that we would have access to, or if they are DC government employees when they are working in the early child care settings in the high schools.
Yeah,
we could ask them about their salary schedules, but they are independent entities.
Okay.
They are, the fact that they're co-located with DCPS is
they're co-located. It's not okay. Okay, thank you.
Like that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
So, okay, we are just about out of time. I appreciate this conversation, and I do feel like there were a few things that bubbled up. Thank you, Marika, for doing a little narration in the chat. It's very helpful. And it sounds like there is at least some general consensus, and I won't hold everybody to it, but that there should be some level of autonomy to pay more than the minimum. So we've established minimum by role and credential in our initial report, and whatever happens with experience, that there seems to be a value on having some autonomy at the center and home level to be able to go beyond that. I'm not sure that we got much further than that on consensus on the other issues, but we've started to delve into them, and I think this will help at least be able to shape some maybe some straw man proposals that can help us pressure test some of those other values balances that Sarah had sort of referred to. I want to give Raleigh a quick second to share some next steps once we send this report off to the mayor and council. What kind of happens next?
Hey guys, so we're planning on introducing an emergency for the February 1 legislative meeting. So there we will be essentially allowing ECE to hire the vendor to make direct payments and to get this money out as quickly as possible. So then we can go ahead and turn our attention to FY23 and beyond. So this weekend I will be crafting that emergency and then working with our general counsel and with ECE to make sure the language is perfect so we don't have any hiccups, and for introduction for February 1, and then we should be good from there. So I'm just want to say thank you to everyone again for all of your time and attention on the task force. And I know Abby was handing out a couple shout outs at the beginning of the meeting, but honestly, we need to give a shout out to Abby. Like, thank you so much for the leadership and the time and attention that you've given this task force and this incredible work on the report. And it was so well written and so well done. So thank you so much, Abby.
Well, thank you, Raleigh. And Cynthia, I see your comment in the chat. So there is, I think we talked about this last time, that the chairman is interested in holding another public hearing in February. So that's still, the timing and exact plans for that are a little bit up in the air, but that will be an opportunity for public comment on the report, which everyone will at that point have access to. So that's a good chance for people to weigh in on some of this. You also now should have calendar invites for 4 more meetings in the coming weeks, and we'll work to get through the key issues that we have identified for our second report. So thanks all. Enjoy the rest of your evenings, and thank you so much. And give yourselves a pat on the back for getting to this next inflection point as a task force. Take care, all.
Goodbye.